Okay, welcome. And once again, thank you for attending this training on best management practices for invasive species in rights of way. I am Matt Wallrath. I serve as the Invasive Species Program Manager for the Upper Sugar River Watershed Association, which you'll hear me refer to as Upper Sugar because that is a very long name, and I only have an hour and a half to go through all this information with you. I am joined by Pearce of the Wisconsin Forest Detectors Network. She's the program coordinator and a great resource for especially terrestrial and reporting of these sorts of things, but she does management all across the state. And her and the Wren's Weed Science Lab do trials for herbicides. They look at the best management practices. So they're really on the cutting edge of what works in Wisconsin in particular. And she'll be sharing a bunch of resources that they developed, as well as online tools and fact sheets and things like that that we can use as we talk about these issues. And she's my co-host, so she'll be kind of running security and letting people into the room. Once again, if you have questions, put them in the chat, leave your videos off, and we can get to questions and answers at the end of the session. Our agenda today, as we look through it, we're going through the NR40 rule in particular and what we're talking about when we mean invasive species. We're talking about BMPs and in particular ways to dispose of. We have some new slides for disposal, talking about landfill operators and managers, how to get rid of the stuff if you have it on site, especially looking at knotweed, as it is can be a tricky one to dispose of properly. We'll be discussing that BMP, so best management practices BMP, for those 5 species in the flyer that we've made. So very common roadside. We'll kind of dive into the details a bit of that so you can have something to chew on while we're thinking about all the other resources we're sharing. And we'll then zoom in and talk about planning your invasive species control prevention program. So online tools such as a calendar for when you can observe things, as I'm monitoring applications, and some other resources for diving into one plant. We can't cover all 200 plants or 200 species that are on the list, 260 or so that are on NR40. So hopefully this is a good diving off point where if you want to then look more deeply into your particular species of interest or your threats, you can go from there. Again, we are a resource, so you can always ask me or Ann or your local coordinator, some of which are in the room right now, for other information on what we're looking at. So, and then we'll finish up with up to half an hour of questions and answers. So we look forward to your input if you have other things that you would be curious about. What are we talking about when we talk about invasive species? This is our very dry legal definition. The key words here being, make sure, and does this look okay? I've got are there any blocks on the window? Are we looking all right? I'm just playing with my Zoom windows right here.
Yeah, it looks fine on my end.
Thank you. The key things here are going to be, there we go, get myself a laser pointer. Yeah. There we go. Ooh, where's my, anyways, the things that are important here are the harm to environmental or human health. So we don't just add anything on here. There are lots of things that you might think of your own backyard as being invasive, but they need to make this list in order to receive attention by the state. Now, ecologically, you can have aggressive things that you want to control. They may even be native, but when I talk about invasive species in this presentation, I'm talking about this statute. We have a full list, and that's how we prioritize work on this sort of topic in the state, because there's so many things we have to have a place to start from that we can all agree why they are bad. And I'm not going to read these. I don't believe in reading my slides, but here are some things that you could think about why they might be an issue for your part of the state, whether it's tourism, whether it's management costs, allergies, lots of reasons. This is just a small smattering, in fact, of the things that we think about when we think about invasive species control and why it's important. That's right. And it's not just a good idea, it's the law. So I do lots of prevention campaign stuff where I actually have folks out at boat landings or doing inspections. And one of the reasons we tell them that they need to get all the vegetation off their boat and the other snails and other things that might stick to their boat is that if they were spotted leaving a landing and a sheriff saw them, they could actually get pulled over and write a ticket to address the issue, up to $200 or for each violation. Doesn't happen that often, but this is not just me wagging a finger and saying these are good ideas. That is true, but I want to be an ally and not have to have anybody go through the process of getting pulled over or having the state come down on you because you're spreading invasive species along your rights of way. It is illegal, and you could get put into stepped enforcement. Not here to scare you. Just want to let you know that's how it actually works. And our 40, talking about viable organisms. So what is a viable organism? It is an organism that can continue to carry on life. Okay, so that means viable seed. That means an animal that could have offspring. It means it could be a root mass that would then grow in the ground if spread. So maybe a bit of a root ball or even rhizomes, little bits of underground runners that can make more plants. And you are not allowed to move those around the state. That is against the law, as I mentioned. There is a list that I will not get into in great detail here. But that's an important thing. It has to be viable. So if you see something that's on the list, but it's dead and cannot make any more seeds, it is actually not covered by this rule. Example being water hyacinth, which is a invasive plant that we don't want to see in our waterways, but they make it into baskets. And that basket, no seeds, no ability to resprout. Even though it's prohibited species, it is not illegal to sell those baskets because they are not viable. And you're here today because you want to hear about the best management practices. And according to this law, if you are doing your best to follow best management practices in your part of the world, if you're following these rules and regulations, you will not be held legally responsible. You might get a slap on the wrist and say, hey, don't do that again. But there is room for error and room for education. It's really about getting the word out and not about enforcement. So follow along, do these things, and you'll stay on the good side of the law, and you'll do the best thing you can for your natural areas and the long-term maintenance of your properties. Got a classic example here of when we're talking about what's viable and what's economically and environmentally harmful. Of course, we've got our banner, which is wild parsnip, this yellow, and that's green and gold. That's the only good thing about it. It's got the right colors. Other than that, it's pretty nasty. It's in the carrot family. We'll get more into this later. You'll see this on the sides of the road. It spreads a lot. And if you're out there and not concerned about it, you can get these nasty photosynthetic burns, stuff that actually cause second-degree burns. We'll skip through that because that's ugly, but yeah, not to be messed around with. So there's reasons for these things on the list. It's not me sitting in my beautiful Madison home office here deciding what we talk about when we talk about native species, because we have to have that as the other side of the equation, right? If you have invasive species, then how do we decide what's native, and then where do we go off from there, right? And the answer is the DNR, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, looks at a work called Vegetation in Wisconsin that was looking at the vegetation that was on the ground at the time of the plots being drawn out all across the state as it was being surveyed at the time of settlement. And that's kind of considered like a starting point for what we think of as, if it was here already, it's probably naturalized or native. If it comes here after, then it gets put into the equation of something that could be considered an invasive species. Now, again, words are important. And when I say invasive species in this talk, I mean, in particular, NR40 invasive species. I do not mean dandelions. Dandelions are not on the list. You might say, well, they're taking over my backyard. That's not my problem. They're not considered environmentally or economically harmful, so they don't make the list. What about red cedar or sumac or aspens? Now, these are all plants that are native to Wisconsin. People say, well, they're really aggressive. They're invading my restoration site. They're invading the sites of my roadside. Well, I would call those a aggressive native plant. It is not an invasive plant. And the linguistics is important because you're making an ecological decision to control those other species, the native species, because you want to have a different outcome. You want to have other things replace them, or you want to have other things grow, but they're native, so they don't get the same prioritization You can choose to control them, but it's not mandated by the state, nor do I worry about it quite the same because I'm more worried about these listed and known to be dangerous plants and animals. I also make a quick note that we are in the process of updating NR40, and new rules about what's on the list and what's prohibited or restricted will be coming in the next few years. So this is going to be definitive for about the next 2 years at least, I would think, but then keep your ears to the ground as far as what's going on out there for long-term lists of what the state is considering. I mentioned categories. I mentioned prohibited. I said that word before. What do I mean by that? You're going to see this red. So some of my slides, you'll see this red outline of the state, a little P in it for prohibited. These are our high threats. These are the things we really want to look at and make sure that we are nipping in the bud, if it were, or preventing, controlling, doing whatever we can to make sure they don't get spread around. That's because they're not everywhere yet. It's not buckthorn, it's not garlic mustard, not the things that we think of. Every city park has these problems. They're very limited in their scope, and therefore they can still be controlled and eradicated before they get super out of control. And because of that, you are not even allowed to possess them, meaning you can't have them on your property. Now, none of these species on this list can be transported, transferred, or introduced. So that those other clauses, transporting means, unless you're, except for control. So if you're doing invasive species control and removal, you are exempt according to the rule. You can transport it. You cannot transfer it, meaning you cannot sell it, trade it, barter it, gift it, sneak it in somebody's stockings for Christmas or whatever. That's not allowed. Santa Claus, I'm looking at you. Or introduce it, which is to say dump it in a space outside of your, just keeping it contained, keeping it disposed properly. So introducing it is also illegal. That's the large category. It's the smaller a list, but it's the more important category for our efforts for prevention and control. Now we drop that possess on there, and we have the restricted species category, which is going to be in orange. These are the ones I mentioned earlier that are widespread, not going to ever be removed. And it's important when I talk about invasive species that I am not a zealot. I'm a realist. I'm a biologist. We're never going to get back to like Curtis times, to like pre-settlement ecology. It's just not feasible. If you think of it that way, you're going to waste your time. You have to think about fighting the good fight when you can, and not saying we're going to eradicate, be xenophobic. We're going to eradicate every single invasive species from the face of Wisconsin. It's neither practical nor feasible. So, focusing on what we can is important, because we don't have all the resources in the world for this. In fact, resources can be quite limited. Just to make things more complicated, we do have some that are split listed. So you can see my colors here. We've got red for Phragmites on the west side of the state, which is prohibited. It's just not very prevalent there, versus it's restricted on the east side, where it's very, very prevalent. And we have a kind of a boundary between that's cross-hatched that kind of lets us know where we're working. And this is right in our territory. So while it's still restricted here in Dane County for Phragmites, we give it a little more credit for control because it is pushing that prohibited as it goes along. I'm not the first person to think about this. There is a very lengthy and very dry manual that I will link to at the end of this presentation that has a lot of great ways to think about this stuff, especially if you're an engineer and a manager type and you like lists of stuff for your planning process. And this is what it's called. There's a link right there. Again, I'll be sending this out in the slides, or if you want to contact me for these links, go ahead. It's a manual, and it talks in particular about transportation and utility rights of way. But it's dry. You'll see some slides that have a bunch of words on them. That's what it looks like. I'll highlight some of the highlights, but not my favorite resource, kind of useful. Also, our neighbors to the north, this is out of Ontario. If you look up clean equipment protocol for industry, this is just it's a more succinct and better pictures. How to clean your equipment has protocols about how to do all this kind of stuff, ID stuff, and sort of ways to prevent certain species too. So those are two resources, and if you want to print something out at home, you can do that. Let's get into our BMPs, our best management practices, and talk about how we do this sort of work. Really important principle right here. work from a clean area and then go into the infested areas. So if you'll see a picture right here of some shrubs coming up. This is actually a goat project that I do out near Viroqua. So we're pushing this edge back, and that's where we would then want to go in and do further work, is where it's pretty pristine already. So if you have just one small population of something that you know is bad, and you can nip that in the bud, dig it out of the ground, spray it, whatever it's going to be, that's a much better bang for your buck than wading into the sea of invasive species that can otherwise be taking over the sides of the road. So those pioneer populations, and working back from the edge towards that big source is an important philosophical concept when we're doing this kind of work. This is a big one. You gotta check your gear and clean it before you go to a new site. So here's some fella doing his due diligence, looking at his crunchy tractor tires, making sure there's no dirt in there, no seeds. A lot of this stuff spreads just in the treads of our machines or in the bucket of an excavator. It's not necessarily simple to do, but it's very worth it. And again, it's required by law. Here in Dane County, we have more stringent protections about these things. There's contracts that go into moving things around that we expect contractors to do. So, but as we all know, the letter of the law and the following of that law are often very different. So that's why we're here in this room today, explain why it's important, give you some resources about how to think about it, and encourage you to get the brush out, get the spray out, do it. Look how many spots we got. It's there's a lot of things on there, but again, it is the law to get out. If ideally you have like a spray system as a contractor's leaving the site, they have a way to do that, where you take it to home base, you knock stuff off there, in a well drained facility that you can control your off spray, because these things it's dirty, and this includes, as a hiker or as a contractor, includes your boots, includes your treads. So carrying around a boot brush or like a spray bottle that you can just spray off your boots. I'm sure your house will be happy when you come home and you're not tracking mud. And again, you're following the law and you're preventing those species from moving around. Just good practice. Plus, clean boots last longer. Clean machines last longer. So here is a picture of if you have a wash pad or a shed, high pressure systems. As you're moving contract gear around, so this is something that when you're looking at your contracts for your and making bids, you can't just assume that because the state mandates this that they know about this or will do this. So it's worth adding a clause in your contracts mentioning NR40, mentioning decontamination, saying we expect this of you. This we're paying you, and this is part of what we're paying you for, is for you to clean your gear and not spread invasive species all over the landscape. And it's because we're the ones that come back and have to manage it long term. And if they can just scofflaw and walk away, well, they might. And I love this just idea of, some dude cleaning off the seeds from the bottom of his, wearing flip-flops, cleaning off the seeds from the bottom of his mow deck, versus somebody out there with a brush cutter. And when these seeds get around, once the things get established, it becomes very, very challenging to control them. So that prevention is really, really important. Know your guy, Phil. Who is this Phil? Where does he come from? He or she, Phil. I don't know. They, them, Phil. This is a picture of knotweed and just how it honeycombs into the side of a embankment. So you think that you're moving dirt around, you think that you've got a nice clean scoop of something. Well, if it looks like this and you have a plant that you know is going to come back, you're doing yourself a disservice, and you're spreading around this really nasty invasive species. I'll get more into Phragmites and knotweed in particular later, because they have a lot of ability to spread by rhizomes, those underground plants, underground roots that will re-sprout. We do have some resources for looking at this stuff that I'll share with you now, kind of classically. So how do you know stuff? And we'll get more into this in a moment. How do we know what's on the landscape? So there is something called the Lakes NIAS Viewer. And right here, I've got little check marks laid out for where we see our non-native Phragmites and our Japanese knotweed. So you can actually get into this thing. There's a link there. You can type DNR likes an ASU or into a Google, and it'll pop you up this resource. And so that gives you some idea when you're planning a project if you have things on the ground that are nearby. However, these are notoriously underreported. So just because it's not on the map, you got to use your eyeballs and maybe some resources that we have here, maybe a ID book or the pamphlet we have, the flyer, to say, wait, is that what I'm looking at? Because these maps are not complete. I prefer EdMaps just because it's an easier thing, especially for terrestrial and rights of way, to get on the landscape. And Anne will be going over that in more detail during her part of the presentation. All right, I told you that we're going to look at some slightly busy pieces of information. So this is what it looks like when you look at the guide that's coming in from Wisconsin, the Transportation Right-of-Way Corridor Manual. So it has all these BMPs and there's all these activities, planning. So it gets really in depth. But I'm not going to belabor this. I just want to say that's what I'm talking about. You know, scout out, locates populations before construction. So think about these things, not when that shovel's on the ground and you already have a plan to move all that dirt over there, but while you're making your site plans. Also worth updating your seed mix. So these are do not use these. This is a double negative, but these are bad ones. So these are still often sold in, like, they will make their way in the state from another state as part of the seed mix. So, you know, clovers, canary grass, crown vetch, broom. Some of these are not even regulated by the rule, but they're canary grass in particular. But you want to know that you want to keep these out of your seed mixes because they actually can cause more problems than they're worth in the long run. And similarly, another good best management practice for revegetation. And it sounds pretty obvious, but you do not want to let empty soil sit around. That's going to be the most common spot. Invasive species tend to have a lot of seed production, high viability of their seeds, and wind dispersal. So they can get to those areas that you just cleared and would like to keep pristine faster than you think. So get that seed mix out there, get that coir fabric out there, or whatever kind of hay it is. Don't let that ground sit. And that's usually the law anyways, but just think about how you're going to revegetate. Moving into some disposal techniques and how we think about these things. That's a picture of me starting a fire. I had permission, but of course you have to get permission from the landowners to start fires, burning some invasive Mediterranean gorse that we don't have here in the state of South Washington State. But, so burning is a great response if you have the ability, if you're a small landowner, or you have, if burn season is on, you have the burn permit, or it's open burning is allowed in your area. Burning does kill the majority of viability from things. So not everything, some seeds are going to be able to survive it, but in general, if you can have a burn pile for your buckthorn and your other things and get rid of it that way, it's a pretty decent option. Now, you can also bury things, but as far as you have like a big pit in the back and you're going to cover it over later, you know, you can do some of that, but it's not a great answer, especially for knotweed. I'll get more into that in a moment. Knotweed is just so able to punch through barriers and grow with very little bits of plant into very large plants. So do not compost. Do not throw this into your compost bin because most home compost systems do not get hot enough to kill off seeds. So all you're doing is seeding your high quality compost with invasive species. Not a great idea. The law of the land is to separate and bag things, and they want them to go into a clear plastic bag that's labeled. I will be honest that I do not carry clear plastic bags and label them. I often just double bag them in big contractor bags and put them in the dumpster, and that's a pretty solid technique. Now you do want to make sure you're not having sharp bits of a plant punching through your bags and spreading out seed everywhere. That's why the double bag is nice. And if you want to reduce your weight, you can kind of stick them in the sun, let them dehydrate a bit before you get rid of them. But that's what I often do, just being honest with that. And there is on this slide a contact for a manager who does this kind of stuff. So if you have questions about a particular species or if things are legal. I'm not the expert on that necessarily, but there is a resource for you to contact along those lines. Knotweed in particular can be a serious threat. You see it right here punching up through asphalt. You see it going into the side of a house. It often spreads in, this is a picture from Sauk County that I took. It's spreading right along these utility rights of way. So it's something that came in with the fill. It can be really, really a problem. You have to treat this stuff with a little extra care. So in fact, in the UK, this stuff is considered, I took some of these recommendations from them. You'll see meters in there. In the UK, there's a whole regulation that you cannot easily dispose of. You can't just dump it somewhere because they consider it to be living hazardous waste. So if you got a big pile of root balls, they, kind of give them a redouse, spray them down, even if they're cut off, so they don't resprout quite as much. Again, do not compost them. Bury them deep in the ground. I mean, that's a serious pit. I mean, 5 meters is, 20 feet, something like that. So 18 feet. So is that really that feasible? Maybe not. 2 meters if you have an approved membrane. So like landscaping fabric that can contain the roots. And then for landfilling in the UK, they recommend that it has to be UV resistant and capable of lasting for 50 years. Now, this is above and beyond what we think of in the States. We don't have these rules yet in the state, in Wisconsin or in America, for how serious this stuff is. But we do want to consider that, and don't move it around. If you want to tarp it up and let it rot for a minute, that can also work for you to dispose of it. So I guess take knotweed with a little extra weight when you're doing this kind of work. Okay, moving into our particular best management practices. So we got some kind of broad brushstroke ideas of how we look at this stuff, and I wanted to go through our great resource that we just had made. So this is available for free. I'd be happy to send you an envelope full of these things. And this is the center of a trifold, so it has a lot of these other best management practices laid out, as well as some timing charts. I'm not going to get into all the depths of that, but we'd be happy, like I said, email me or talk to Pete Jopke at Dane County. He can also get you, he has a big stack of these things too. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at 5 different species that are very common in our parts of the state that I'm hoping this will get up on somebody's bulletin board, and it'll sit there forever in their shop, and people will look at these pictures and these ideas. So we can kind of get more, I'll break them down, but we're talking about parsnip, teasel, purple loosestrife, knotweeds, and non-native fragmites. So I'm going to zoom in a bit on these 5 species. We already mentioned wild parsnip, and it's up to 5 feet tall. It needs lots of sun. And again, this is a picture actually from my roommate, Chris Knoll. He took this, interestingly enough, and I found it online. If we look at our recommendations, this is where we get into detail the best management practices for each species. So we have a picture of the leaf when it's in its first year stage there. We have a picture of the flowering bits. And then you'll see that we recommend mowing. And that's not always the case. So if you get it at the right time for wild parsnip, you can do a lot of good work. Now, it's very particular. And you want to cut it when it's setting the second set of, so these are called umbels. You can see my pointer here. Each one of these things is an umbel. When they set these secondary umbels, which they're kind of coming down from the bottom. There's nothing real clear in here, but when they set the secondary bit of them from bottom of the stems, that means that they've gone fully into seed mode. They will not resprout. If you cut them earlier, they'll just resprout. If you cut them after they've gone to seed, they're already dead and you're just spreading the seed. So I do not recommend that. And it does take a long time to do this, but mowing does work. And then here are some, we have a specific particular recommendations for your, the volume by volume that you would use to do the spraying. So either broadcast or spot spraying down there. Again, this does give you these nasty burns, and here's some better pictures of the what it looks like year 1, and it lives for 2 years. So year 2, it sends up its stock and set seeds. There are some lookalikes out there. So cow parsnip has a similar kind of flower, though it's white, and then golden Alexander, very similar flower, but different leaf structure. So, get your ID guide and want to think about it before you cry wolf. And just a quick highlight that we're also looking at poison hemlock moving into the area. Has these much finer leaves. It gets confused sometimes with wild parsnip. White flowers and this characteristic purple spotting on the stems. And we do have a native one too, but if you see this stuff, again, you do not want to eat it. You don't get it on your skin. It's nasty. Okay, going to teasels. You see 2 to 6 feet tall. They're very distinctive. They have this kind of evil looking flower head on them. Lots of spikes, lots of little sharp serrations and things, egg-shaped flower heads. And you'll see these spiny bracts come. There's these sharp spiny things coming out. Very, very prevalent in our part of the state. Not so much up north, but it spreads pretty fast. So recommendations on this are also to mow. So this is another one that if you get it at the right time of the year, and you can do it before it goes to seed, is going to be able to, with repeat mowings, knock it down, because it's going to just tire the plant out. And again, we've got some recommendations for different types of herbicide. A little more about ID here, zooming in, just the way that they flower and what they look like on the ground as well. So for your ID and reporting needs right there. Okay, purple loosestrife. It's a wetland perennial and quite lovely, as you can see, quite widespread. Between 3 to 7 feet tall, distinctive stems. It's got these very knobby, almost mint-like looking stems. They have these kind of facets to them. And you can see here, as we zoom in a little bit more, 5 to 7 petals. And you can see that stem being a bit, we'll call it digital. It has these very distinct facets to it, and nothing else is going to have the size and the vigor in a wetland and this color. There are other native lookalikes that are purple. Just because it's purple doesn't mean it's bad, but this size, it's very woody, and it takes over our wetlands and can kind of change the hydrology, and it displaces our native plants without being a great source of food or habitat for our animals. So we kind of declare this one to be mowing ineffective. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't cut it then that first year. So you can prevent seed production, as we're seeing, if you can mow things on the side of the highway. So as you see, it says mow in late summer after flowers emerge, but before seeds. So if you can get out there with the big mow deck and knock it down, you're going to take out a lot of its energy with seeds for that year. You're not going to necessarily be able to control it by mowing all the time. It's a lot of work, and it's usually back in wetlands, and it's hard to mow because it likes wet areas anyways. And it does respond pretty well to herbicides. It's also a state-approved biocontrol program that I do. Not to get into that too much, but we do have a coordinator that works with those kind of things. If you've got a big infestation, you might consider a very dense infestation. You might consider contacting the state to talk about, or your local aquatic invasive species coordinators about getting into the biocontrol program, which involves rearing beetles and then releasing them. Then they do the work for you. As long as you can get the plants out of the ground, rear some beetles, you got yourself a project. All right. Japanese knotweed. Now we're gonna kind of go, and this is the knotweed. I'm doing some research on this right now. We're gonna say invasive large knotweed because we kind of call everything Japanese knotweed, and we're finding out that in fact a lot of it is Bohemian, and it's confusing. I'm doing a genetic study on that, so we'll have more information on this. This stuff is huge. It's up to 16 feet tall. It makes these gigantic patches. And you can see it's kind of, so these stems are hollow when you crack them open, and it's in the buckwheat family. It looks like bamboo, but it's not. It's in the buckwheat family, and you'll see these old infestations over the winter. They turn this kind of tawny yellow color, but the canes are still there. It makes it actually pretty easy to spot when everything else drops because it has so much above ground mass to it. And you will see massive infestations, and it's sad to say, but I see these alongside the highways or like up in the dells. There's entire islands that are just knotweed, like acres. It's really nasty stuff in that it poisons the ground below it for other plants. It shades stuff out. It's super disease. It's very hardy and resistant, and not a lot eats it. So you really want to avoid spreading this stuff in your fill, or kind of, definitely don't plant it or buy it or move it around. Check the treads of your machines. If you do control in those projects, make sure you get out there and knock that stuff off so you don't move it around, because I see it moving along the sides of highways all the time. So don't mow it. It's not gonna, for controlling it, you technique wise, you might want to cut it low in the middle of the growing season so you can spray it. However, just cutting this stuff does not control it. And you can see I have the recommendations there to burn or dispose in landfills. You don't want to have these resprouts coming in, just lying around or washing into the stream. I have some knotweed right in my own backyard, and I've been pulling the plants out every 2 weeks for the entire growing season, and it still has energy. So if you think that you can mow this stuff more than I pulled myself in my backyard, I doubt it. So you're going to have to use some pesticides on it, most likely. Not my favorite response. It's always integrated pest management. But that being said, some things you just have to use all the tools you have, and this one is so aggressive that you want to consider an herbicide treatment. Check if it is wet too. You might have to get a permit for that, and be a licensed applicator. But if your feet aren't wet when you're spraying it and it's not going to spray into the water, you should be okay. So that's a quick blast through of our recommendations and some best management practices. Again, happy to share this resource with those that are interested and get them out to your teams and to your contractors and your townships and whatever else, to the mow crews that are doing the real on the ground work. So let us know if we can get you a stack of these, and I'm happy to mail them out. With that, we're a little ahead of schedule for our agenda. That's just fine. I'm going to pass this over to Anne, and she can share her screen, and we can talk about the tools that she has at her disposal that we can get out into the public. Looks good.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. So Matt's given a lot of really great information about some of these priority species and definitely gave us a good overview of NR40. I'm going to move into just sharing some tools that we have through the Wisconsin First Detector Network and the Wren's Weed Science Lab that might help with some of the planning for going forward with managing invasive plants, whether that's on roadsides or in other settings. And when I think about invasive plant management, I kind of like to break it out into these 5 steps. This is by no means me saying like, this is the way you have to think about it, but I think it's helpful to put things in this context, think through these steps to make sure that you're thinking about some of the key issues as you're planning. So first, identify what species you have in the areas that you're managing, and that's both the invasive species and perhaps what other species are around, species that you might want to protect and promote growth of. The second step is understanding the population of those species. And in particular for today, we're thinking about understanding basically where the infestations are of invasive plants or other plants that you want to control. Third step is looking at figuring out what are going to be the most appropriate and effective management techniques for the species that you're managing. And so the recommendations that Matt just showed from the brochure are great for those priority species. But just remember that managing invasive species is a very species-specific endeavor. So what works well for one plant may not be effective at all on a plant that's growing right next to it. And so you definitely need to do some research before you start doing the management. Which brings us to step 4, which is once you've done the research and made those plans, actually apply the management on the ground. And the crucial step 5, and make sure that you're following up, monitoring the sites that you've managed so that you can retreat them if you need to. You can assess whether those management techniques that you selected actually worked, or see if populations are shrinking or growing. And so a lot of the tools that I'm going to talk about or resources are really focused on this step 2, and that's basically thinking about getting a map of where your invasive plants are. And so why do we want to map? Matt already pointed out earlier that it's really key for planning. So, you know, before you've got equipment on the ground, if you're moving fill and dirt around, where are these invasive plants? Are you going to run into those? But specifically for planning the management of these invasive plants outside of construction projects, having this visual of where your infestations are is really key for knowing approximately, you know, what are your resource needs going to be in terms of managing, where do you need to send these resources, and how are you going to prioritize what you manage and when. So this map is just a screenshot that I took of some of our priority species that we just talked about. So the teasels, the knotweeds, purple loosestrife, and wild parsnip. And so this is, you can see from kind of southwestern Dane County heading into neighboring counties, lots of wild parsnip along these roadsides. That's not a surprise for anybody that's been here in this part of the state. But then we'll see we have a few infestations of knotweeds, few pops of teasel. We've got some purple loosestrife heading down south. And so once you have this visual, you can start to see, okay, we don't have a lot of knotweed. Let's make sure we hit those populations before they start spreading. We do have a lot of wild parsnip, and so that's going to be maybe a bigger planning effort, but we can look at where are our really dense populations of parsnip and where are the outlying populations. And as Matt mentioned earlier, it's often really helpful to start with those outlying populations, catch those, and then work in towards the really dense infestations. Specifically, if you're mowing wild parsnip, don't start in the densest area and move out, because you're likely going to be spreading seed out. So try to start in those farther out, less densely populated areas and move towards the big infestations. And this map that I took the screenshot of comes from our WISTIP viewer. Too many acronyms, but it's the Wisconsin Shared Terrestrial Invasive Plant Presence Viewer. Basically, this is a map of our known locations of terrestrial and some wetland invasive plant species. So Matt showed us earlier the lakes and AIS viewer. So if you're looking at aquatic specific species, that's the place to go. Both the map that Matt showed and the map that I'm showing have those more wetland species like the knotweeds and purple loosestrife and Phragmites. So you could kind of go either way with those. But if you're looking at more strictly terrestrial species, including the teasels and parsnip, this is going to be a good resource. And this is an online interactive map, so you can use these drop-down menus and other features to create a custom map of species for your area. And that one, you can get to this from the WIFTN website. I think at the end, I'll share this link in the chat, or we can send it along in a follow-up email, but it's just in under our tools section. And speaking of making maps, several of you might be coming from organizations that already have great mapping systems. Maybe you have like a GIS person on your staff. Maybe you're using ARC collector or GPS units and you're already mapping things. But if you're coming from a point where you haven't done much mapping on your roadsides or elsewhere and you're interested in doing it, I think Matt and I are both pretty strong proponents of using the EdMaps tools because they're free. EdMaps is basically the largest invasive species database in North America. So the data that goes into that is publicly available, which is great because you can see what other people have reported in your area, or if you're partnering with other groups on some of your management projects or planning, you can all see the data in the same place. And I'm just going to really briefly highlight the current apps that EdMaps has and let you know that if you're interested in learning more about these or getting training for you or your staff specifically on the apps, then please reach out to me because that is my job, to help people learn how to use these tools. So starting with the EdMaps app on the left, oops. If you have heard of the GLEDN or Great Lakes Early Detection Network app, if you've been around Matt and myself for the past several years, we've talked a lot about that. The EdMaps app is replacing the regional apps like that. So the EdMaps team basically originally developed apps for the Great Lakes, for the West, for the Mid-Atlantic. So they had all these apps all over the country. And to make their lives easier, they're just saying, we're going to one app called EdMaps. And basically you just select the state that you're working in once you set up the app. It's great for using with volunteers or seasonal staff or others that maybe aren't super up on their invasive plant ID skills yet, because it has a built-in field guide. So it's got that tool in there to help people figure out what they're reporting. I will mention though that all of the reports that get submitted in Wisconsin via the EdMaps apps do get verified. So there is some quality control on the data there. The EdMaps Pro app, as the word pro suggests, is kind of designed for maybe a higher user level. So there's no field guide in there. So if you have people that really need that extra help with the field guide, either direct them to the EdMaps app or make sure that they have other identification resources. But this one is really great if you're working in similar areas repeatedly, because it allows you to pull in previously reported infestations that are in the EdMaps system, pull it into the app so you'll see a map of what's already been mapped. And so if you're revisiting a site, you can just click on what's already been mapped and report a revisit to it. So you can say, yes, this is still here. It's bigger in size or it's smaller in size. Like we mapped it last year, now we've treated it. So there's a lot more ability to do follow-ups. And then also if you're working in an area that has spotty cell reception or no cell reception, you can also get offline maps to work with this EdMaps Pro app. So it's a bit beefier of an app in terms of its ability to kind of deal with ongoing projects. I'm just going to really quickly, for those of you who haven't been exposed to the EdMaps or Gladden apps before, just show you basically what it looks like to use them. And I'm just going to show the EdMaps app. So this is the one that has the built-in field guide where you can get pictures and descriptions of all the species. If you're actually mapping an infestation though, you would be reporting a new sighting. And this is basically what the reporting form looks like. So the app will autofill the date and time for you when you open up that report. And then you can add whatever species you see in front of you to your report. For those of you that are familiar with Gladden, you could only report one species at a time. Sorry, my daughter is crying in the background. For EdMaps, one of the great upgrades for that is if you're looking at a patch of invasive species and you're saying, we've got Dame's racket, we've got garlic mustard, we've got this and this and this all in the same place, you can put that all into one report instead of having to make a separate report for each of them. You can take pictures. In Wisconsin, like I said, we verify the reports. So we ask people to add photos so that we can double check the identification. But you can also use these photos to kind of keep track of what's happening at your sites. And then with the map, if you want to do point records, the app will automatically record the GPS coordinates where you are, or you can manually place a point or draw a polygon. So it's a pretty straightforward reporting process, pretty easy to use once you get the hang of it. So nice tool, again, if you don't have a system already for mapping invasives. And then just on the EdMaps website, there's a lot of information here. You can get, this is an additional place for just general identification information about species. If you want to see distribution maps across the country of where these species are or where they are in Wisconsin, you can check those for single species at a time in their distribution maps. Or if you use these mapping tools, you can also use the My EdMaps portal, I'll call it, to manage your records. So this is what it looks like when you get into My EdMaps. They've got this whole dashboard thing. So if you're an invasive plant nerd like Matt and I are, you can track how many records are coming in or how many you've reported. But to actually manage your reports, along the left side menu, there's a reports section. You get a list of every report you've ever made. And then on the right, you can manage those reports. So maybe you need to edit it to add more information. Maybe you want to report a revisit. Maybe you need to delete a record because it wasn't identified properly. Whatever you need to do, you can do that here. And when we're talking about mapping, Matt mentioned earlier the huge list of species that are on our NR40 rule. And I think of the 260 some species, like 140 of them are terrestrial or wetland plants that you many of which you could encounter on roadsides. So that brings up the question of like, okay, so you're telling us mapping is good, and you're telling us there's like over 100 species we might need to be aware of. How do we know when or where to look for these species? And so one tool that we've developed with the First Detector Network is this calendar that's trying to help with that question. Our volunteers use this to help to figure out when and where to monitor for plants, but it definitely works for planning as well. So on this calendar, each row is a different species, and then each column is a month of the year. And as you can see from the legend on the right, the color of the circles denotes what is the dominant life stage of that plant each month. And then how filled in the circle is shows how detectable or how easy it is to find or identify that species in that month. And so a reminder that this is just a general resource, like it's not going to be exact. Some species, like garlic mustard, for instance, the flowering of garlic mustard might really depend on what kind of spring we're having. Obviously, there's differences from the southern part of the state to the northern part of the state in terms of emergence and flowering timing, but it's meant to be a general idea so you can know which species to kind of keep track of throughout the season. And then we have on the top this whole series of drop-down menus that lets you customize this calendar however you want, pretty much. So if you're working in an organization or a department and you've identified that you have a set of priority species that you know you want to manage or keep an eye out for, you can use the scientific or common name drop-down menus to select just those species and shrink this calendar to just those species that you're concerned about. I often use it with my volunteers who are monitoring and mapping invasive plants throughout the year. We'll just select whatever month we're in and select the detectability for the medium to high, so that shrinks the list of species in our habitat, whether you're working in woodland or grassland, and I'm pretty sure we have roadside specific here too. That'll shrink the list. So basically lots of ways to customize this to help you figure out when to look for things. This is also helpful when you're considering management timing. So if the recommendations are that you're hitting those spring or fall rosettes before the plant is flowering or after it's done flowering, this can help you figure out when that timing is going to happen. If you need to mow before something has mature seeds, this can help you with that as well. And just like that WISTIP map, this is on our WIFTN website under the Tools tab. All right, so finally, I'm going to get into some more resources if you're looking for management recommendations beyond the brochure that Matt showed. So if you're looking at other species that aren't in that brochure, or if you want additional recommendations. And these are housed on our lab's website, which is rensweedscience.cals.wisc.edu. We'll put that in the chat so you don't have to write it down. For those of you working specifically on roadsides, we had a big effort in 2019 where we set up research plots in 5 locations in the state, and we looked at wild parsnip, wild chervil, and teasel control with a number of different herbicides, different mowing timings, hand removal. And so we have fact sheets specific to those species and efforts on the website. For other species, 35-ish species, we have these extension fact sheets as well, which give identification information and then recommendations for chemical and non-chemical control, including how effective is that control in the season you apply it and in the season after, specific rate recommendations for herbicides, things like that. And so from the Wren's Weed Science website, if you click on a resources tab at the top menu, both the extension fact sheets and those right-of-way specific fact sheets are under that tab. The last resource I want to mention, mostly specific to current herbicide research that we're doing in our lab, is that we have reports for our current and ongoing trials. And so under the research tab on our website, if you click on this weed management trials link, you'll be brought to a page that has a big long table of all of the trials we've been doing for the past 10 plus years. Our lab does work in pastures and cropping systems in addition to doing work on invasive plant control. So when I visit this site to look for information, since I'm very squarely in the world of invasive plants, I just use the search box on the top to get invasive, and then I'll be limited to just our invasive plant research trials. You can sort any of these columns by year or species. And then a lot of these are really looking at herbicides and comparing maybe a new herbicide or to what has been the recommended standard, or checking up on like, here's what people have been recommending for this species. Let's actually test it out and see what's working here in Wisconsin, for different timings, for different application techniques. And so for each of these trials, you can get a full report, which is going to give you all of the data that we collected if you really want to dig into it. Or you can read the summary, which will tell you kind of what's the objective of the study. So what treatments are we comparing? And then what's our kind of broad outcome or recommendation based on that study. So yeah, again, happy to help answer questions, happy to do training on EdMaps. Please do feel free to reach out, and then I'll throw these links in the chat box as we get into our Q&A session here.
Thanks, Ann. Cool stuff. All right. We do have an extra moment. I want to just show off the power of EdMaps and how neat and kind of broad it is. So as Ann was pointing out to us, got my share up? Yep, okay. So I'm looking at my old nemesis, the knotweed, right? And it's just, when you're doing your planning, if you have a species of interest, you can just zoom in, you see it all over the place. And these things actually start to pop up as you get closer and closer. So it starts to tease out what we're looking at in particular. And it's just really cool to see one, see if I can find one that has pictures of it. Or maybe one that I reported myself, my own backyard. So as we zoom in here, so now we're getting these particular records. So they kind of resolve with the legend of what they are. And I know that I made one on the Garber feed mill loop. So let's see if I can find that one. So I got a picture in there too. There we go. So if I go by zoom in here and say, all right, right about this, and what these guys. Getting closer, getting closer. This is my backyard. Come on now. Resolve thyself. There we go. So I click on this puppy. It actually gives you your record. So it's going to have a permanent record. That's me. And so these are pictures that I took. And so if you go ahead and click on that thing. So this is how you can actually share these out in a static point. So if you give this link up here, that ID number is going to be permanent. And so if you wanted to share this with somebody across the boundary from your municipality, you can do that. And so again, you're drawing these reports, and you get to actually see where things are being drawn out there with some pictures of it, and just verified by Ann. So this is your team in action. It's just nice to be able to actually, lay out these polygons. So it does the math for you. And I am happy to say that I need to actually go in and do a eradicated revisit on this one, because I did not do this, but I reported this on EdMaps, and sure enough, if the land managers didn't see it and kill it. So sometimes just even doing the act of reporting is enough to get people to give a crap on the landscape. So it's always fun when that happens, and I get to go back and see my reports being eradicated without me doing anything besides using my smartphone to take pictures of them in the first place. Other thing is this Lakes and AIS mapping tool. I mentioned just a little bit more demo how to get there. So if you're at your surface water data viewer, go to additional resources, you click on Lakes and AIS viewer, that will pop this thing up. And then this is only for wetland and aquatic species. But now you can go ahead and click all of these check boxes on over here on this. There's this show layers, and you go down here and you can click these things on and off. So if you see these here, these are verified by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. So they're much more limited in their reporting scope, but they're also going to be high priority and easier to find funding to do things with the state, because once they're in this database in particular, they will prioritize funding to control them if you can write the grant or get the staff and team on that. So just a little bit of fun in-person stuff here.
Yeah, and Since you were looking at EdMaps, I saw that Lisa had a question in the chat, and
Oh yeah,
she's asking, what does the verification process
oh yeah.
consist of? And so I can say for the EdMap side of things, Lisa, what happens is that we have verifiers in the state. So myself and my supervisor, Mark Renz, we both verify reports for plants across the state, but we have people that can be set up as verifiers more locally. And basically what happens is when somebody submits a report to EdMaps within the state of Wisconsin, we get an email notification saying that we have these reports ready to review. And so we can look at the reports, we can see where was it mapped, whether it was a point or polygon. We can see the photos that people submit, and we use that information, like the photos and location, to say like, yes, this is a correct identification and it makes sense. And if that all looks good, we basically mark the report as verified, and then it gets released to the public side of the database where people can view the records like Matt just showed us. In the case where the identification seems off, or maybe it's a high priority, like a prohibited species, and we don't think that other people have learned about it yet, whether that's, you know, the county AIS coordinator for some of these wetland and aquatic plants, or our other partners at DNR for terrestrial plants, we basically reach back out to whoever submitted the report just through their email, because they need an email account to set up using EdMaps. So the verifiers are the only people that have access to that. So we would reach back out to that person and say like, hey, I need this additional information. Or in the case of the priority or prohibited species, we might say like, this is like a high priority report that you just submitted, just letting you know that we're sharing it with these additional people that need to know about it. And typically that's the DNR folks, because they're the ones that are the regulators in NR40 and the ones that can direct action on the ground if that needs to happen. So hopefully that clarifies the verification for EdMaps, but let me know if you have other questions.
Thanks, Ann. Good question. Okay. These are the links to some of the, again, this is available, I think, in the chat, or I can send you along. I'll just copy and paste this when I send up the follow-up email with this video, and if you, not the slides or the PDF of the other things, so if you want that, you can bug me in there too. And so we do have the particular decontamination manual code that you can look into, also very dry, but do the best you can to clean your gear off. That's the most important thing. We want to share this stuff out as best we can. We're all here because we care about this, and it's up to us to craft a narrative of why your teams might care. It might be different for each county or township. So hopefully we're available for trainings on this, or, you know, a kind of that stitch in time idea is pretty good. Before you do your planning and get too far down the road, make some errors. There are also other partnerships that we can rely upon in your region. So I help with the South Central Invasive partnership here in our part of the country, but there's a regional, these are called cooperative invasive species management areas. So if you want more help with planning and communication, then if you see your county is lit up on this map, you're going to have a coordinator, and they might already be working on these things, or maybe they could use your help to continue to do their mapping processes and control work and prevention, outreach, education, the whole gamut of things we want to talk about before we can, while we're doing this work together. So with that, we are ahead of schedule, and that is just fine. I want to say thank you for attending out here in Zoom land, and look forward to seeing you on the ground. Please don't be shy. Reach out to us with questions. As I said, follow up for information, more trainings. And I will get this out to you on YouTube for your for posterity. With that, I'm going to go ahead. Any final thoughts, Ann, before we close it up here today?
I was just gonna give a final call out for folks. If you have questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask, or throw them in the chat. But since we do have some time for that, but otherwise I don't have additional thoughts. Okay. I'm going to stop our recording, and we actually, you know what, we can record. I can always trim this. We'll keep going. We'll keep live, but we are now in our question and answer part. So if you want to pop things into the chat, go ahead. Or if you would like to
unmute, put on your video. We are now in live in real time. Thanks, Kim, for the shout out. Thanks for the links there. So yeah, and I see some of my allies and volunteers and co-coordinators. So it's an inspiring group of people here. So any other questions that we can think of off the top of our head?
So I see that Kim just asked the question, are maintenance crews responsive to training? And I think that just like training on any sort of new initiative or like getting new management off the ground, it can take a while for things to take hold. But I can share based on some of the work that our group did in 2019. I mentioned like the demonstration sites across the state. We collected some survey data, and I think we were getting the survey data primarily from more of the managers than the crew members themselves, but attending these trainings, and specifically the trainings we did in 2019 and looking at demonstration plots, a lot of those, like by far the majority of the people that attended as managers said that they've changed the practices within their crews in terms of management timing or management techniques. So certainly the more that we share this sort of information about managing plants on roadsides, it's getting out there. There's a lot more management happening and a lot more planning happening to get management going than I think even 5 years ago. So, and Matt, I don't know if you have additional thoughts on that.
I guess I don't see as many people making reports on EdMaps. I think Ann and I are both. We would like to see more widespread adaptation of the EdMaps protocol. So I give these talks fairly often, and we don't get a ton of people making fresh. It's me and other kind of invasive species geeks making the mapping happen. So we could definitely use more increase of that. I guess I've been curious to see what we can do to get more uptick of reports on the ground. But yeah, the partnerships I've worked with, Grant County, Greene County, Dane County, this is definitely important stuff to get in front of people. So I know Greene County's made changes to how they do their mowing and some of their protocols for cleaning stuff off. So it definitely does make a difference. It can be hard to teach an old dog new tricks, and a lot of people that have been doing this, they're like, why would I get off my mow deck to clean? I've never had to do this before. Why would I do this now? So the narrative and the training takes some time, but when you do the cost benefit analysis and show them that if we do this way, we pay you for it now, but if we don't do this and it spreads, we've got this gigantic problem on the road, that can help out for kind of getting it into people's heads that it's high priority. Okay, I got a question here from Tom. Any resources for planting seed in conjunction with controlled invasives? For example, if you're taking care of wild parsnip, you introduce seeds of other species. There's seeding mixes, that you want. First of all, yeah, you definitely don't want to. There's kind of generic seed mixes for different parts of the habitat. So I know what Prairie Moon Nursery does it. You can think of any other nurseries that do particular seed mixes, Anne, or like where do people source these things for different habitats?
Off the top of my head, I think it depends on the situation, whether you're working on roadsides or more of a natural area. So I think that's the sort of question that if people have specific questions, they should email us and we can get them the specific resources. Mm-hmm. And that's when Matt and I give answers like that, we're not trying to like cop out of giving you a real answer. It's just like when you're planning management, doing management, planning restoration, like there are so many site-specific pieces of information that we need to be able to give solid recommendations. So yeah, that's my answer for that. I will also, Midwest Invasive Plant Network recently put out some general guides on how to plan for that sort of restoration to prevent invasions. So I'll put those in the chat as well. They have one guide for kind of the land manager and one guide focused more for like homeowners if you're working more in a backyard sort of setting.
Good rule of thumb is look around. So if you see this infestation of wild parsnip, and then you see some native, wildflowers growing in the field next door, or you see kind of a grass that is, is native to the area, get that, and you already have success. So if you can follow the success of what happens right there in the ground in that ecosystem, it's likely going to be able to survive again. Otherwise, winter rye and like a bioswale mix or something that can do kind of seasonal inundation. Again, it might not be a native, because native plant seed is really, really expensive. It's just hard to collect. It's very lightweight. So you sometimes end up doing something that's maybe not ideal, but at least will cover the ground. And if you can get that ground so it can't just accept and easily sprout up invasives, even if it's not your ideal, you know, if you want prairie drop seed, that's great, but that's not always going to grow on the side of a road. So use what works and look around the habitat, and that's going to give you a kind of a nice palette to work with.
Hey, Matt, this is Pete from
Hey,
Dane
Pete.
County. Great job, both of you. We have a fairly large dog park out at Indian Lake County Park, Western Dane County. We've kind of worked with a local landowner in the area. He'll kind of made an agreement with him. He can come in and cut almost a couple hundred acres of grasses, which has a high population of parsnip in it. And we've been following this recommendation that you guys laid out for the last 2 years, and we're going to renew our efforts with this landowner for another couple of years. So we're getting the best management practice taken care of, and then in exchange, he's taken that grass for his cattle. But we've seen a significant decline in the number of parsnip plants in the specific area. And as it's a dog park, not only are humans potentially impacted, but we've had a lot of complaints of dogs getting blisters on their bellies and sides of their face, which I never knew they were sensitive as well to it. So it's kind of been an interesting experience for us, and just wanted to share that. It's been working really well with the mowing, at least at that particular site.
Thanks, Pete. I got a question about knotweed. As it poisons the ground, is it hard to reseed the area with native plants? I don't have a great answer for that. I've often seen that while the plant is growing, it seems to, so it's called being allelopathic, which if you're killing stuff underneath you. But then I've seen spray happen and stuff moves in reasonably quickly. It's not quite scorched earth. You also have that bioaccumulation of pesticides sometimes too. So in my experience, like doing some right-of-way stuff and spraying it and then coming back the next year, if there was an existing population, you didn't do overspray and over death, the native stuff moves back in pretty quickly. Do you have any other insight on that, Anne, or anybody else with reseeding?
I mean, I would just generally say too that it might come down to, if you are treating knotweed or other species with an herbicide, just when you're selecting your herbicides, make sure is it an herbicide that has residual activity? Because that can impact, if you have an herbicide that has residual activity where it remains active in the soil for X number of months, if you seed right away, probably your seeds are not going to have very good success, versus if you have an herbicide that doesn't have residual activity in the soil. So again, kind of depends on what you're controlling, and if you're using herbicides, specifically like making sure whether it has residual activity or not, that's going to direct how you plan your revegetation.
I get asked quite often, can I start planting in my shrubs or reseeding even while I'm still in management with knotweed? And I always say, just wait. Don't put good money into a project until you're pretty sure that's eradicated. So with knotweed, we recommend, it's usually 2 years of vigorous spraying. The first one knocks it back. The second one, you get the resprouts. The third one, you get the last of the resprouts, and then 2 more years of monitoring. So, year 4 and 5, if you're convinced a spot might be pretty well controlled, you might do some replanting in there at that point. But if it comes back, you have to spray it again. It's better off being a little hesitant and working, especially the high density patches. Those big root crowns that are massive, they can take a long time to be fully controlled. So because that stuff's so expensive, I would err on the side of making sure you got it eradicated before you do the hard work of replanting and seeding and all that kind of stuff too. Also a good note that as Anne mentioned, the different types of pesticides, I've had some interesting experiences with knotweed in particular, where someone thought that more was better, or that making some sort of crazy cocktail of 3 or 4 different things. I'm not going to say who this was or that I was involved with that too much, but it was happening on the year, and they weren't getting anything permitted. And I went out there and was like, we do this at the right time with the right pesticides, and it's actually going to work better. So they were just spraying a bunch of stuff all the time, like 4 times a year. And I was like, no, don't do that. Like, listen to our techniques. So when we talk about species specific management and those resources, those fact sheets that Anne pointed out, it's kind of counterintuitive. As a botanist and an ecologist, sometimes the pathways make sense to me, but I have a lot of training, and sometimes I'm still like, wow, I would never think that I would want to spray then, or I would want to do this first. It's all science tested stuff that is not always just one size fits all, one poison fits all, one cut time fits all. So digging in, doing the research can really kind of lessen both your expense and improve the eradication. Got a homeowner's guide on here. That's good stuff. Great.
Yeah, and Kim made a comment about EdMaps is hampered by slow verification in Indiana, and that's kind of a case by case basis. And I think that's, as Matt and I mentioned, I think with all the maps we've pointed out, they're pretty limited. They're a good resource, but they're by no means comprehensive. And I think in Wisconsin, it's because we're hopefully going to get more people to adopt using EdMaps and similar tools to do the mapping. We have plenty of verifiers, but yeah, in other states, maybe you've got the mappers and don't have the verifiers. So it's not a perfect system, but if you're in a state outside of Wisconsin where your EdMaps verification is slow, maybe using a better system or a different system is better for you, so you can get that report information into a usable form. EdMaps also allows bulk uploads. So if you already have data and you're like, oh gosh, I don't want to go remap everything just to get it into EdMaps, if you can throw that data in a spreadsheet or a shapefile, we can get it into the EdMaps database if you want to use those EdMaps tools going forward. So that's another process I can help with. And yeah, Kim, hopefully you'll get some more verifiers down in Indiana.
Definitely job security, invasive species world. I wish we could say, again, that's hedging your expectations and making sure you're not being overly zealous or demanding complete control of all sides everywhere. It's just not feasible. So picking those battles is super important, and always more training and more associations out there, the better. Thinking about these issues. All right. Take another pause here while people can think about questions.
I think everybody's brains are full, it looks like.
It is. It's a long training with no time to pee. So I get it. I hope that you're doing good out there. Let's see if I got my. This is not there. Okay, great. Well, with that, I want to say thank you again to Anne for her great work and all the tools that they've built over the years, and being a steady hand for verification and training. So you can bug her. Thanks to the Lake Monitoring Protection Network, which is a Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources program. So they fund my time to do this, and our partnership with Dane County. Pete Jopke's in the room, and all the other coordinators here. We all are a team, so it's great to see the team coming together for this kind of stuff. I just want to thank the planning teams that encourage these sort of things to happen, because it's every year we do this, and I think we're getting more and more traction, more and more resources out to people, and better adaptation of these things into practice. So that's very heartening for me.